Well, this evening we're going to be talking about varieties of Jewish culture. We've tried to, as we've gone through holidays and life cycle events and music and art, to give you a flavor of diverse Jewishnesses, or Jewish cultures, maybe, getting beyond the standard Eastern European / Ashkenazi style that most American Jews are familiar with because that's their family background. There's actually a phenomenon people describe now called being Ashkenormative. Sort of like being heteronormative, where you assume every couple is male female. Ashkenormative is assuming everybody eats bagels and kugel, and that's just the only kind of Jewish food. But the reality is that Jews have eaten different foods in different places because they've had different cultural surroundings, environments, influences. And even their clothing differs because, why would you wear a fur hat in the Middle East? Except there are some Jews now who do that because, as we talked about before we started, some of them just keep doing what their ancestors did and they don't feel free to change it. Even if climate-wise it would make a lot more sense to not wear the long dark suits all day long in the Middle East. That's the trade-off of tradition. But over the centuries, there were plenty of traditional Jews who nevertheless did become integrated to the surrounding culture and changed quite a bit. And when we talk about the varieties we're going to be exploring today, we're not really dealing with the Ashkenazi communities. We're actually not dealing with the Sephardi Jewish communities that spoke Judeo-Spanish and came out of Spain and found their way into the Balkans, into the Ottoman Empire, and into Amsterdam, southern France, and generally around the Mediterranean, plus in Northern Europe. We're not talking about the Sephardim. We're not even really going to be talking about the Mizrahim, the Eastern Jews who spoke Arabic, either in North Africa or in Arab countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. Those are also a very prominent Jewish population. We're actually going even more off the beaten path than the Sephardic Jews and the Mizrahi Jews, getting beyond the Ashkenazi Jews. We're talking about communities that are really none of the above. They're unique in their origin and in their expressions. They didn't speak Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-German, aka Yiddish. They were something off that map entirely. And there are other diverse Jewish communities all over the world, but they claim origin from Ashkenazi backgrounds. So almost all the Jews in Australia, for example, were originally Ashkenazi Jews. They just wound up in Australia because of fleeing the Holocaust or post-Holocaust survivors or whatever, or British colonialism. Jews in South Africa, likewise, were almost all, in fact, most of them were Lithuanian Jews, even more specific than just Ashkenazi Jews. So we're not talking about the Ashkenazi Jewish diaspora. There are even a whole clutch of Ashkenazi Jews in eastern Siberia in a place called Birobidzhan, which was a Soviet Jewish territory that Stalin set up in the 1930s and deported a lot of Jews to, encouraged them to emigrate there.
Deported.
A long time ago, they were promised this agricultural homeland, and it was Siberia. I'll sometimes talk about what I call the romance of manure, where you get this idea, oh, I'm going to go work the land, I'm going to be a farmer, and then you deal with manure, and it's necessary, it's valuable, it's helpful, and then it's manure. And if you're raised in the city, even if you're raised in a farm, you're probably not a big fan of it, but if you're raised in the city in particular, you realize it's where the rubber hits the road, and maybe I'll go into the city and do something else. So the Birobidzhan experiment is really interesting in its historical oddity, but again, it's just Ashkenazi Jews moving around. It's not the specific cultures we're talking about. There were also interesting battles between the so-called German Jews and the Russian Jews, or the German-speaking Jews in America and the Yiddish-speaking Jews in America. Again, this is diverse Jewish communities battling over what language to speak, how assimilated to the surrounding culture, but it's just a battle of Ashkenazi, Western Ashkenazi and Eastern Ashkenazi. Okay, and we're not going to cover them all. This class is an hour and not 6 or more. So there are a lot of these diverse Jewish communities scattered around. There used to be a museum in Tel Aviv called the Diaspora Museum. And they actually changed the title of it to the Museum of the Jewish People. And one of the reasons is that a lot of these communities are no longer out there. So they're more relic communities than actually living communities in those spaces. So you can see examples of their artifacts and their material culture. If you go to the Israel Museum, for example, in Jerusalem, there's a beautiful set of exhibits there of diverse Jewish wedding dresses and menorahs from all over this Jewish diaspora. But the communities they came from, in most cases, are not there. That's true, by the way, also for the Arab world. You know, there's like 10 Jews left in Iraq and 2 Jews in Afghanistan. And there used to be tens of thousands in those countries. But for political reasons over the 20th century, most of those communities are gone now. But there are Jews in the Central Asian territories. In Baku, Azerbaijan, there was a deeply rooted community. There were mountain Jews in the Caucasus. There's a tribe called the Lemba from South Africa that have maintained particular Jewish practices and actually show what's called the priestly gene in the Y chromosome that seems to be a marker of some kind of Jewish ancestry at some point. And there's also a group in Uganda called the Abba Yudaya, which means like the father of Judah, that claim the Jewish ancestry, that may have converted in the 17th, 18th century, but clearly identify as Jewish. We've even used their music from time to time in things that we've done. Remember, this concept of Jewish dispersion goes back a long time. When you read the Bible, there was a whole kingdom of Hebrews that was supposedly destroyed, and they were dispersed. You know, the lost tribes of Israel, you hear that motif. So you can get people all over the world who will claim to be one of these lost tribes, and is it real? Is it sort of a claimed ancestry? Do we want to get in the business of telling people their whole tradition was wrong? I don't know. In fact, there's one example of that from a community in Portugal, which were conversos. They'd converted to Catholicism, but maintained a kind of secret Jewish identity for many centuries. And one of their traditions is to go to the river during Passover and beat it with branches and pray for Moses and Esther to deliver them through the water. Now, Moses and Esther are not in the same book.
I was going to say
They're very far apart in the Jewish narrative, right? So, do you want to tell them they're doing it wrong?
Not when they
But they've been doing it for centuries. And is it wrong? Is it just a different evolutionary branch? So all these claims to Jewishness and where they come from, we don't want to get into the arbitration of you're wrong or you don't look Jewish. If I can achieve one thing in my career, it'd be to end the concept of you don't look Jewish. Because what does looking Jewish mean anyways? That gets into either ashkenormative, right, or racial stereotypes. And there's so many people who have now been raised Jewish or have Jewish ancestry from intercultural families where one partner comes from a very different ethnic background, people who themselves have converted to Judaism or joined the Jewish people, and all of these diverse communities we're going to talk about that have a long and rich Jewish ancestry that look very different. I mean, the Jews of Yemen look very different from the Jews of Poland, and the Jews of Cochin, India look very different from the Jews of Poland. So why should we assume that everyone who looks Jewish has to look like, our Bubby, if you're using that Ashkenazi terminology? Okay. Now, what ties all these communities together? Well, they often have some similar features. They generally have some concept of a religious law based on the Torah or some kind of revealed scripture. They often have very strict gender roles. Men and women are expected to be doing different things and to fit into those traditional categories. Many of them have the experience of a bilingualism. This is something that we talked about previously, the idea that they have some connection to Hebrew and also their own interior Jewish language, like Yiddish, where if you were a Jew living in Poland, just to use the familiar example, you might have spoken Polish to your neighbors, but often you spoke Yiddish at home and you used Hebrew in the synagogue. So you had two Jewish languages that were for internal use. And that's common in a lot of other Jewish communities. But sometimes they also would adopt the outside language, yet still keep their alphabet. So we have examples of Judeo-Persian, where Persian is written in Hebrew letters, or Judeo-Ge'ez, where this Ethiopian Semitic language is written in Hebrew letters. Sometimes they adopt the Amharic script, and sometimes they maintain the Hebrew alphabet. So this is an example where they're sort of domesticating the outside language, but in their own unique way. And all these communities had in common a sense that they were in exile, that they belonged somewhere else, that there was a promised land. Most of them faced Jerusalem. But of course, it wasn't always facing east, because if you were in China, it was west. And again, the Ashkenazi model is it was the Mizrach, it was the eastern wall that you want to be facing. But if you're somewhere else, if you're in the eastern diaspora in Persia, you're looking west, you're not looking east. So this is, again, how the different settings changes Jewish life in meaningful ways. Now, where are they diverse? Well, they're diverse because they're living in diverse climates, they're living in diverse surrounding cultures. There's particular histories are going to diverge. When were they persecuted? When were they allowed to be free? When did conquerors show up? And the populations with which they mixed would be different, so of course, that's going to really change things too. So, I'm going to talk about 5 specific Jewish communities. These are all communities, by the way, that are profiled in this book called The Historical Atlas of the Jewish People by Eli Barnaby. This is an older edition, there's a newer edition now. But what I like about this book is an exploration of Jewish history, which we'll be doing in 2 years in this class cycle, is that they have wonderful sort of detours on specific Jewish communities. So they have this whole section on I'll put it from the camera here, this whole section on the Jews of China. So it has an example of what their synagogue looked like, it has pictures of the territory, it gives you maps, it gives you timelines along the bottom, so you can understand when these developments show up, what sources do we have to testify to this community. There's also one on the Jews of India, there's one on the Jews of Persia, which we'll be talking about, and also a couple on the Jews of Yemen, the Jews of Ethiopia, and more. So the idea is that it's, in addition to a general survey history with, the founding of modern Israel and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and those kind of big events, it has these nice cultural detours too. And we use this textbook primarily for our introduction to Jewish history class. As I said, we'll be doing that in a couple of years, but occasionally the side detours are useful too. So, the Jews of China. No Chinese food jokes here. It's not related. These are actually pre the exposure of the West to Chinese at all. You have to remember that the major connection to China for many centuries was what was called the Silk Road, which was a series of cities scattered through Central Asia that enabled traders to travel safely from China to the West and bring silk with them, which was light, and so it was very portable, but it was a trade secret that the Chinese had of how to make silk. And so it was unique in the Western world, and if you wanted silk, you had to do the trade with China. So it made China very rich in European gold, and the Europeans very dependent on the Chinese for importing the silk. And the traders who did that route could become very wealthy, and it led to these Jewish settlements in Central Asia and so on, and even as far east as the source of these wonderful cloths, and that was in China itself. The oldest testimony we have to the presence of Jews in China is from around the 8th century of the Common Era. So that's, relatively ancient there. We're talking, 1,300 or more years. It was a business letter that was written in Persian, but in Hebrew letters. But it's referring to Jews all the way out in this community in China. And during the Mongol period, we also have testimony that Jews migrated there. Certain laws describe Jewish dietary laws and Muslim dietary laws and circumcision practices and ritual limitations to the Sabbath and what day they observe and rest. And so we even have a synagogue built from people who moved to the area, there were about 1,000 people importing cotton to China. They kept permission to settle in the 10th century, and by 1163 they built their first synagogue in a place called Kaifeng. In fact, by the time Marco Polo makes it to China, the Jews have been there for a couple hundred years. And when the Portuguese missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries, show up in 1600, they find a Jew already at the court of the king, who talks about his home community in Kaifeng. And so there's testimony over the centuries of seeing this community there, seeing their Torah scrolls, seeing their ritual practices. But over time, they gradually became integrated. When your only line is your family name and the fact you don't eat pork and that you observe the Sabbath, that begins to wear down the differences, especially as you marry into the local population, and you become more or less indistinguishable. And by the 19th century, they had basically abandoned their family names to Chinese family names and had lost much that was distinctive. And then at some point, the synagogue fell down or burned down, and they didn't bother to rebuild it because there weren't enough Jews left to make it worthwhile. And they didn't have any rabbis there after the 19th century, as far as we know. Actually, after the beginning of the 19th century. And so, in the end, the community simply faded away. But it's one of those interesting episodes that we have clear evidence of in many written sources to confirm it, but we don't have a lasting legacy of that community. Second example are the Jews of India. Now, many of the Jews of India showed up there with the British Raj. They came from Iraq, or they came from other places as merchants. They were part of the British population that came there. So again, that's not what we're talking about. There are actually Jews in India going back to the late Middle Ages. And they are in a couple different locations. There's one group called the B'nai Israel that are on, I believe, the west coast of India, and then the Jews of Cochin, which are on the east coast of India. They have different backgrounds, but what they have in common is they all practice circumcision to some extent. They had some kind of a Sabbath, and they had some dietary laws. Now, what's unique about that in India? That's standard, is to have your own separate community with your own ritual practices and your own dietary laws. And so they were one of many religious minority groups in India, and again, relatively well integrated to the surrounding community. If you see pictures of the B'nai Israel, again, you can see them in the course book. They, to my eye, look Indian. So that's the fact that's a product of the fact that in most cases, these communities, as we can tell both by archive evidence and by genetic evidence, were founded by men who were traveling for trade. They settled down, they married a local woman, and then they ran their family. And in patriarchal societies, the woman would adopt the man's religious culture. But if you study the X chromosome, or actually if you study what's called mitochondrial DNA, which you only get from the mother, from the egg, that seems to reflect the surrounding population. But the Y chromosome link tends to have a Jewish heritage going back. So that's how the Jews of India look different from the Jews of Yemen, is because they married local women, and that's how the genes mixed. This is the case for these B'nai Israel in the west of India, and they ultimately served in the British Raj. They were attracted to the colonizing power, as Jews often are in a minority situation, and ultimately wound up moving to Israel by the end of the 1960s. The Jews of Cochin, further east, came at a different time. They were descended from traders who arrived during the Muslim Empire, when the Muslims had conquered large parts of India. And there were actually a split within the Cochin Jews between the so-called white Jews and the black Jews. The black Jews were the descendants of slaves that had converted and then been freed at some point. And the white Jews were from higher caste connections. And they maintained separate communities for a long time. And it's sad that within a minority you still have this kind of hierarchy working, but we know that happens as well in the African American community. There's light skin and dark skin privilege and discrimination there too. As was the case in many places, they were attracted to the language of the conquerors, English, and so they also became well integrated into the British Raj. One of the challenges that the Cochin Jews did face is that when many of them did decide to leave and move to Israel, they had trouble getting recognized by the Israeli rabbinate. It wasn't until, I think, 1964 that there was finally a government designation saying, yes, they're really Jews. Because again, they didn't, quote, look Jewish. They had somewhat different practices, and obviously they were making Indian-style dishes for their holidays. And this is one of the shifts now. We love this Jewish diversity stuff. We thought, oh wow, isn't it great that these Jews of India made this wonderful dish for Passover? But at a certain time, it was seen as beyond the orbit of normal, and then it made their status somewhat questionable. A third group are sort of in between the Middle East and this Eastern diaspora. So if you've got China and India on the far eastern end from our European-oriented map, right? Because we don't have to start in Europe, but we tend to. In between those two, you have a community of Jews in Persia. And the Jews in Persia are not really Mizrahim in the same way, and they don't describe themselves that way either, because they were connected to the language of Persian. And as you may know, Persian is actually an Indo-European language. It's not a Semitic language like Arabic or Amharic or Aramaic. So it sounds more like a European language. And the Jews of Persia came there many centuries ago. In fact, most of them arrived there during the Babylonian exile. At least their roots go back that far. And that was in 586 BCE. When the Babylonian Empire fell, it was conquered by the Persians. This is Cyrus the Great. And he allowed the Jews to return, and some Jews did return, and they rebuilt the temple. But some Jews stayed, and they stayed in Babylon, which would become Iraq, and they stayed in points further east as well in the Persian Empire, and they became very well rooted there. After the fall of the Persian Empire, there was an empire called the Sassanids, and they were Zoroastrian. And that was a harder path for the Jews to follow. The Persians were relatively tolerant. They had a polytheistic system, and you have, multiple gods, no big deal. Zoroastrians were more intolerant of religious minorities and began to persecute Jews more rigidly. The Jews were actually thrilled around the 7th century of the Common Era when a new power showed up called the Muslim empires. And what made them attractive was they were much less likely to persecute the Jews. In fact, they created a category of life called dhimmi, which was a tolerated minority, for Jews and for Christians for that matter. Actually didn't apply to Zoroastrians, which led to the Zoroastrians being somewhat persecuted by the Muslims until they could come to some accommodation. The Jews having a monotheistic religion and having a written revelation qualified as this tolerated minority, and so they were able to live and be relatively prosperous in that territory. Again, it's on that Silk Road, makes it a valuable place to be.
Isn't the issue of the Zoroastrians because they were not people of the book?
Right.
So Jews and Christians were tolerated by the Muslim empires as special communities because they were the predecessors, so to speak.
And they had a written revelation that's part of that line.
Yes. But the Zoroastrians were, except for the 3 magi that show up at the manger, they're not really anything related to what's going on.
Right, exactly. So they're not part of the orbit of acceptable practice. And the other thing that happened with the Persians that has a long-term impact on Jewish life is when the Persians do finally convert, they do not convert to Sunni Islam. They convert to Shiite Islam, which is an offshoot. This goes back to the early years of Muhammad, where his nephew Ali thought that he should have become the next caliph, and Muhammad's uncle, I think it was Abu Bakr, took over instead, and there's a battle, and Ali dies, and then his followers refuse to give up, and so they, you can lose an election or have your leader die, but people can still follow them, for a long time afterward. And look at the Jesus sect, right? That's still going. So the Shiite Ali, or the opposition of Ali, became a kind of offshoot of mainstream Sunni Islam. They had a concept of a Mahdi, a kind of messianic figure that would return. Anyways, not to get lost in the history of Islam. The point is that the Persians, as sort of a protest move against the Sunnis, who were the dominant style of Islam, converted to Shiite Islam, which was an acceptable offshoot, but still somewhat different. And Shiites, because they were looked down upon by the mainstream Sunni Islamic establishment, then could look down again on the Jews, who were there as a tolerated minority, but on a lower status than any Muslim, even a Shiite Muslim. So Jews in Persia actually faced much stiffer persecution and sometimes outright pogroms or simply abusive treatment than other Jews living in the Middle East. In North Africa, for example, in Morocco, they were much better tolerated than they would have been in Persia. So, for example, there's a contract called the Pact of Omar that details what rights and responsibilities Jews can expect from the surrounding population in that dhimmi status and what limitations they have to accept. So they can't build their synagogues too high, they can't ring their church bells or blow their shofars too loud, but they can live in a sort of subordinate status. But in Persia, Jews were considered to be defiling. So a Jew couldn't even bathe upstream from a Muslim. They had stricter requirements. So in some ways, the Pact of Omar could be interpreted strictly, more discriminatory or less discriminatory, but also sometimes they would add limitations to it that were even worse. And this is a function of this animosity between the communities. So you can imagine that Jews growing up in that setting, even if they've been there for centuries, even if they're well rooted in it, even if they're writing poetry and other works in Judeo-Persian, and there's a huge Judeo-Persian literature from the medieval period, they're feeling oppressed given what's going on in that period. And even outside travelers, Westerners, will travel in and testify to what the experience of the Jews is in that time and place. What really changes for the Jews in the 1920s is, of all people, the Shah. Because when the Shah of Iran takes over, he puts the clergy back in their place, and he maintains a somewhat secular republic. So much so that in the 1950s, he had positive relations with Israel. That's where Israel got a lot of its oil, was from the Iranians under the Shah. And Jews were very supportive of the Shah because he opened up opportunities for them, eliminated all these discriminatory rules. Well, guess what happens in 1979? Yeah, the Shah leaves, is deposed, the Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, and thousands of Persian Jews flee because they're in danger of real active persecution. There are still some tens of thousands of Persian Jews in Iran, even today, but they are a very oppressed minority there. They're suspected of being Zionist agents, and they have to periodically say they hate the state of Israel because it's the only way to be safe there, and it's a very uncomfortable situation. Most Persian Jews are no longer there. They're in Los Angeles or in New York. And really, a lot of them wound up in Los Angeles, both for climate and, for whatever reason. Some went and some followed. But the Persian Jewish community is largely this diaspora American setting, or in Israel, of course. There are also many Persian Jews there. Fourth group to talk about are the Jews of Yemen. And the Jews of Yemen are a very ancient community. Again, they claim descent going back even further. Supposedly there was an army that was sent out in the Maccabean period that never came back, and maybe that was the beginning of the settlement. But we certainly have testimony of them being there by 500 of the Common Era. Shortly before the period of Muhammad, there are Jews in Yemen, and they're well known. And remember, Yemen is on the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's a very important place if you're going to do boat trade to India. If you're coming down the Red Sea, right, from Egypt, from the Middle East, or from the Mediterranean, and you sort of portage across, you don't want to have to go all the way around Africa. It is pre-Suez Canal, but still it was more workable to take stuff from Aqaba and go down all the way through the Gulf and out past Yemen and on your way to India along the coast. So it was a very valuable place to be situated, and it seems that numbers of Arabian Jews made their way down to Yemen. There's also sort of a spice coast there that you could then do trading up and down the coast of the Red Sea in Arabia, which is where both Mecca and Medina are, right along that trading route. So they started out with roots in Arabia, but eventually, as time went on, they became closer to the Maimonidean Egyptian style of Judaism around, let's say, 1000, 1100 of the Common Era, more so than the Babylonian Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud. In fact, some of the laws that they had follow Maimonidean rulings. There's even a famous epistle to Yemen, where there was a fake Messiah in Yemen that Maimonides got a letter about. He said, what should we do about this? And he writes a whole letter of advice back to them. So we know that this Yemenite Jewish community has very, very ancient roots and was in contact with the dominant Jewish community. Some of these isolated Jewish communities, by the way, lose contact with the mainstream Jewish community. So they might have the Bible, the full Hebrew Bible, but not the Talmud. And so they won't do rabbinic style practices. This is the case for at least some of the Jews of Ethiopia, as we'll see in a minute. In the end, the Jews of Yemen go into a steep decline, beginning in, let's say, 1600 and going forward. The Indian trade begins to decline, both because of circumnavigation and just because of other economic dislocations. And there's a religious fanaticism that begins to rise. In the 19th century, there's the rise of what's called Wahhabism, which is the ancestor of Osama bin Laden and that sort of Islamic fundamentalism, and also a real Shiite uprising in Yemen. We see even today the battles in Yemen are between Shiites and Sunnis. And it's a proxy war for which two big countries? Saudi Arabia for the Sunnis and Iran for the Shiites. So again, when Shiites are preeminent, we've seen in Iran, it's not so good for the Jews. And so the Jewish communities begin to be more persecuted. By 1945, about 30,000 of them have made their way to Israel, even before the founding of the state, when it was still Palestine under the British. And in 1950, after the state's founded, there's a massive wave of persecution, and almost all the Jews remaining in Yemen are moved in a massive airlift called Operation Flying Carpet to Israel. In 1950, about 50,000 of them are brought there relatively quickly. In fact, some of them are so unaware of what's really going on, they are taken from the mountains with their goats and animals onto the plane or whatever. And one of them even tried to light a fire on the plane because they got cold. And they had to be told, no, it's not what you do here. And these are like cargo planes. These are not, passenger planes. So again, you have the Jews of Yemen, this wonderful, rich culture. They have major sages and their own music and beautiful brocaded clothing that they made. And again, it also finds its way into Israel. And then finally, there's the Jews of Ethiopia. They refer to themselves as the Beta Israel, the house of Israel. They're sometimes called the Falashas, but that's the sort of epithet that the outsiders use for them. They call them foreigners. And we have to remember that Ethiopia was a very diverse kingdom with lots of different ethnic and religious groups in conflict with each other. And the Falashas are one of these groups dating back to the 13th century. We have some records of them as being allied with or against some other of these tribal confederations. Now, they claim their roots actually go back to the 12 tribes, one of these tribes that got lost, or even King Solomon. You may remember there's a story in the narrative of Solomon that Solomon married the Queen of Sheba. And where is Sheba? Well, it's either Yemen or it's in Ethiopia, which are right across the Gulf from each other. And it may, that's where they claim their roots from. Again, this is sort of a fanciful claim we can't either prove or disprove. But most likely it was Arabian Jews that sort of found their way across that narrow gulf. They speak as a ritual language, Ge'ez or Ge'ez, which is a Semitic language as well, in common with other Ethiopians, of course, speaking that as a ritual language. And they had their own traditions, and again, going back several centuries. They were discovered in the 19th century by ethnologists, Jewish ethnologists who rediscovered them, and then were able to connect them with the mainstream Jewish community. They have their own scriptures. They have, which includes the Hebrew Bible. It also includes Amharic translations of some books we only knew from the Second Temple period, like from the Dead Sea Scrolls communities and other examples. They had some books of those carried forward in their Holy Scripture, and they were brought to Israel mostly at the end of the 20th century. I think the Ethiopian famine in the 80s, so there was a wave brought then, another wave brought in 91. Basically, about 30,000 people were brought over from there. And in Israel, they also face the challenge of getting recognized by the Israeli government. And they've also faced racial issues there, because even though Jews in Israel had Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, they didn't have a lot of black Jews. And they had imbibed a lot of those European attitudes toward Africans that we were still learning about even in this country. So much so that at one time, women were given Norplant contraceptive implants and didn't know that they were what was being done. And there were also incidences of their blood donations being automatically discarded because it was assumed that they were contaminated with AIDS and they wouldn't accept it. So, and then even today, there are issues about treatment by police and the same kind of dynamics we have here. They have some racial issues there as well. So what do all these communities have in common? Well, they all had some kind of Sabbath practice, the day of rest, which is not a universal phenomenon. We're used to it now with the weekend, but that wasn't always the case. They all had some variety of male circumcision. They all had some kind of dietary laws that kept them separate from the surrounding culture. I mean, even if it was not eating pork in China, that was a big difference from your neighbors. They didn't necessarily have rabbinic laws, so they would not have had 2 days of Passover. They might not have separated milk and meat. Remember, the justification for that among the rabbis is you will not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, which on surface reading doesn't say anything about having separate sets of dishes or having to wait 3 hours after you eat meat. This is all rabbinic additions to it. And a lot of these communities didn't have those because they didn't have active ongoing contact with the rabbis as those ideas were being developed. And I do like to use that evidence of the Jews of Ethiopia or other communities like this to demonstrate that the rabbinic and today Orthodox claim that all of Jewish law was given at Mount Sinai to Moses. And some of it was written down in the written Torah, and some of it was just passed on word of mouth by the oral Torah, and the Talmud is exactly the oral Torah that Moses got. Well, that doesn't hold up. Because look at these communities. They have a written Bible, but they're not following the Mosaic practice. And if it had all been passed down perfectly, they would have had these other practices too. But if the Bible was completed at a certain point, and the rabbinic laws developed in a different way at a different time, well, then that would make more sense given that evidence of these diverse and scattered Jewish communities.
So the Jewish Testament is sort of put together, and the latest editions are sort of what, to 200 BCE pretty much?
Well, so we have the oldest text examples we have of the Hebrew Bible are from the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And the Dead Sea Scrolls has examples of every book in our current Hebrew Bible except for Esther. There's no fragments of that we found there, so most likely they didn't have it because they valued these books and had. I mean, you can't prove they didn't have it, but the odds are there's a lot of reasons they wouldn't have had it. You know, it's set outside of Israel. There's an intermarriage. Doesn't mention God anywhere in the book, so you can see why this community might have chosen not to have that one. But they have all the other ones. We also have copied versions of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of what we would call the Old Testament. And that has all those same books plus some other ones in it that are not part of the Hebrew Bible, they're part of the Catholic Old Testament.
So my question is that the scriptures that we have from these 5 communities or any other communities, do they contain all these books, or do they have additional books?
Yes, they generally have those 5 books for sure. The Torah is something that all
Torah,
Jewish
but I'm thinking of the list.
But the rest of them, I think all of these communities we talked about do have a complete Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
I know for sure the Jews of Yemen did because they were in interaction with
that's
so,
the trade we're up against.
the Jews of Persia for sure, because they were not that far from Babylonia, which is where the Talmud's put together. The Jews of India, I believe, did. The Jews of China, I assume so, because they're part of this Silk Road.
On trade routes.
Yes, right, exactly. So there is, a chance to write letters and get advice back. And the Jews of Ethiopia, I'm not sure they have every book in the Hebrew Bible in their canon. I think they have most of the Hebrew Bible books, and then they have some of their own books that are part of their canon. So it's not an identical canon. And I think also their Torah scroll, I think it has 6 books in it, or 7 books. It's a heptateuch. It's got 7 books in it.
That includes Joshua and...
Right, Joshua and Judges, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit longer of a scroll than ours would be, than the sort of dominant Jewish 5-book Torah is today. Oh, actually, I think it's an octateuch. I'll have to check.
So that's interesting, but there was a lot of connection between, what's interesting is that the Yemenites at one point actually controlled Ethiopia, which is one reason there may have been, and there was a Jewish kingdom, like there was a set of Jewish kings in Yemen for a while.
Right. Yes, it's actually an octateuch. Here, I'll share this on Zoom so other people can see it. Share here. Yes. So their Holy Scriptures is in Ge'ez. Their holiest book is called the Orit, or the Octateuch. It's the 5 books of Moses plus Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Yeah, interesting choice. Now, remember in the Septuagint canon, that's where Judges appears. That's where Ruth appears, right after Judges. Because the book of Ruth begins in the days when the judges judged.
Yeah, that's right.
So they put her there, where in the rabbinic canon, because Ruth is read during a particular holiday, the festival of Shavuot, they put it with the festival scrolls near the end, which is where Esther is for Purim, which is where Echal Lamentations is for the 9th of Av, and so on. So they put it with the festival scrolls.
Why is Chronicles at the very end? Because it seems to duplicate a lot of stuff that's in like Kings and Judges.
Well, it's the summary, but it's also a priestly version of that earlier history. So it's like, it's your appendix that tells the real story.
Gotcha,
And
okay.
if you're the priests who are putting this all together, you want it to, be highlighted. In the Christian Septuagint-based Old Testament, they put Chronicles earlier.
Yeah.
But right, and also in the Protestant Bible too,
Yeah.
exactly. Because the Protestant Bible kept the book order of the Catholic Bible and just took out the books that weren't in the Hebrew canon, because Luther decided those were the Apocrypha, those are the.
That's why they took out Maccabees 1 and 2.
Took out Maccabees, they took out Judith and Tobit and some others like that are part of a Catholic Old Testament. So this is where you get, when people say we want the Bible in public schools, you say, which Bible?
Yeah, really.
Because the Hebrew Bible is different from the Catholic Bible, which is different from the Protestant Bible, which is different from the Eastern Orthodox Bible, which is other books in it. So there's no one version. But yes, so this definitely has the Torah. They also have the Book of Lamentations, and they have part of the Book of Jeremiah. They also have Deuterocanonical books like Sirach, Ben Sirach, Judith, Esdras, Maccabean, Jubilees, Baruch 1 and 4, Tobit, Enoch. And so these are books that we have other scriptural examples of elsewhere.
Yeah, Jubilees is a whole bunch of that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but
right.
That's not, yeah.
Exactly. But this is part of their canonical writings that were preserved in their community.
That's just fascinating.
And then they have their own community writings that they've written over the centuries too. So that's where each of these groups are really fascinating. And I did a seminar just about a year ago, that was called Judaism Off the Beaten Path. And we looked at the Jews of Babylonia and the Jews of Ethiopia in more detail. And I'll put a link for that video in the description for this video. So if people wanted to see that in more detail. This is part of what makes Jewish life interesting, is to see all of these communities in their great diversity all around the world doing the same things, but differently. And, if we rely on, this is the way my grandparents always did it, maybe that gets old after a while. Or maybe our dietary laws have changed, we're vegetarian. And so we'd like a rice and bean-based dish instead of a brisket, meat holiday. And so then we have to go off the beaten path and look for those other approaches to do it. I think people are more interested in that today because it's different and interesting, but still in the Jewish family. I love, for example, the idea that Persian Jews did for Purim. And for Persian Jews, by the way, Purim was a major holiday because it takes place in Persia. And so they burned Haman in effigy, for example. That was one of their rituals. Another thing they would do is they would write Haman on the sole of their shoe. So they would be scuffing out Haman's name all day long. And I've always thought that'd be a fun thing to do with Sunday school class, have them write with dry erase marker or chalk or whatever on their shoes, and then they could remember they're scuffing out Haman all day long. But the question that does get raised by this is, there's a couple of questions to think about. One is it cultural appropriation to just pick up this practice of a Jewish community to which you have no family connection? Or is being Jewish or connected to Jewish life enough to justify your doing that and not feeling like you're, putting on Persian face or something? Kathy, you were going to jump in at some point?
Oh, I just wanted to ask you about another group.
Sure.
I understood that there was a Central Asian, Kazakhstan,
Yeah,
that became Jewish because their king or whatever became Jewish.
Oh, you're thinking of the Khazars, yes.
Yeah, the Khazars.
Right.
How do they fit into this? Are they like Persians or?
No, that's another one of those Central Asian communities. And the Khazar story is interesting. They were stuck in between Christendom and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided to become none of the above. And they converted to Judaism. There's actually a famous book written by a medieval Jewish philosopher named Judah Halevi called the Kuzari, where he imagines what was the dialogue that this Khazar king had with the rabbi, that the rabbi was able to prove that Judaism was the best of all the religions.
Mm-hmm.
And so he writes a very philosophical book trying to explain why Jewish tradition is the best and the other ones are wrong. Maybe he's right, but...
Are the Khazars related to the Mongols at all? Because...
Yeah, I think they're part of a similar Turkic
because
kind of
the Mongols had a tendency to adopt religions wherever they went. They kind of had their own sort of basic thing,
as the Ottomans did.
Yeah,
the Ottomans were Turkish and then became Muslim as they came in.
Right, but right from Turkestan, but,
Yeah.
but I mean, like, the ones that ended up in Persia became Muslim, and the ones that ended up in China, you know, Genghis Khan become Chinese, and, you know,
Yes.
they kind of adopted the.
So I mean, in this case, it wasn't that they had conquered a large population of
Yeah.
Jews. They,
Well, no.
for whatever reason,
obviously
the
not.
king decided to make the kingdom Jewish, and there is no archaeological and other exterior testimony beyond Judah Halevi's philosophy of this. There was even a Khazar Jewish community that made its way into Poland at one point. And one of the sort of problematic theories that's out there is that the Khazar Jews are actually the ancestor of all Ashkenazi Jews. If you read Arthur Kessler's book called The 13th Tribe, he has this theory that the Khazars are really the ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews. Not that they came from Germany and went east, that they somehow migrated out from Central Asia. It's not really a reputable theory among ethnologists these days, but you'll find it popping up here and there on the internet because somebody read Kessler's book again and thinks it's this brand new thing. The similar kind of thing happened with Moses and monotheism, which is Sigmund Freud's last book, where he speculated that Moses was really an Egyptian. And Freud's a very smart man and has written some wonderful things about the human psyche, but he's not an Egyptologist, he's not an archaeologist, and he was out of his field, and
Well, you know,
it's just not justifiable.
sorry, I don't know, I did, about a year ago, I read an article somewhere that they had done some genealogical work in Eastern Europe, and they said from there that a large part of what was the Ashkenazi population in Eastern Europe had genes tracing them back to a lot of these silk.
Like the Black
What do you
Sea,
call
or
it?
the Silk Road.
Silk Road, thank you. I don't know if that came to anything.
Well, that's part of that question of how many of these Khazars wound up migrating north
Yeah.
and how many stayed. There's also a claim that most Ashkenazi Jews descend from 4 women because they have the mitochondrial DNA roots and whatever.
Well,
I haven't taken the deepest dive into the genetics part of it.
Well, I
but it is a
haven't followed
fascinating
it up
field.
at all, so I have no
Right.
idea. But I have one, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
real
sure.
quick technical question. If you said if the Chinese community and the Jewish community in China sort of disappeared in the early 19th century, where did that picture of the synagogue come from? I mean, they didn't have colored pictures back then.
Yes,
So.
it says in the captions you can't read that it was the model
Oh, it's
is
a
reconstructed from
reconstruction.
drawings by
Okay.
Portuguese missionaries.
Okay,
So
I thought maybe it was still there.
No,
Yeah.
they built it, it burned down. I mean, when you build something in 1163, there's not a lot of buildings that have made it, certainly that are wood buildings that have made it
Well,
since
yeah, that's true, but
1163.
if someone's taking care of it. Well,
Right,
you said
that's-
nobody was.
That's
so
the very last, in the end, the community declined. So I have Earl and Marlene raise a hand there online.
Took me a while to unmute. I've heard that the Ethiopian Jews were one of the lost tribes and really had no contact with the regular Judaism until modern days when they were discovered. And I was wondering, and I've tried to find out and I've never really gotten much, but are there any practices that tie us to them that are the same, that sort of prove that our traditions go all the way back, or things that are radically different?
Well, so that's an example where I mentioned the milk and meat thing. They would not eat pork, for example, because that's described in the written scripture, but they didn't really have encounter with rabbinic Judaism, so they might have milk and meat together in a traditional dish. So we also have to remember that if you're thinking about it archaeologically, the 10 tribes that are lost, that's the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel around 722 before the Common Era. But the Torah isn't really compiled into its final forms until 500 or so before the Common Era and brought back with the Babylonian exile. So you don't even have the first 5 books altogether when those 10 tribes are, exiled. Now, if you believe the rabbinic chronology, their theology says Moses got the whole Torah and the whole Tanakh. Everything is revealed before the exile, and they have it all. Although it does raise the question, some of the prophets that are in the Hebrew Bible are post the northern kingdom being destroyed.
Well,
So how could any of those 10 tribes have gotten the prophets that are working after they're already gone and dispersed? They might have had the Torah if they believe Moses got the Torah. But again, archaeologically, academically, we think the Torah is developed later. So it'd be unlikely that any real descendant of those 10 tribes would actually have had the Torah that we have today. But the community of the Jews in Ethiopia did have the Torah. They had other books in that Hebrew Bible, as we saw, but they also were missing a lot of books in the Hebrew Bible. They didn't have the Book of Kings. They didn't have some of the prophetic books. So this is a case where their canon was different. So maybe they branched off many centuries ago, but they branched off before the canon was fixed.
Right.
The canon is finalized most likely around the year 90 of the Common Era, when they finally decide these books are in and these books are out. And here's the order.
But the rabbis are.
And the rabbis are doing that, right. But the Jews of Ethiopia don't have that canon there. So
And they
maybe
don't
they're,
have rabbis, right? I mean.
and they have different kind of clergy. They have a kes is the name of their authority,
Is it like
and
a
it's more like a priest.
Hmm.
And so they just have a very different approach to clergy, a different approach to scripture, a different approach to holidays. They actually have a different holiday. I'm blanking on the name of that holiday, but it celebrates the giving of the Torah. So I'll pull the Wikipedia summary back up because it has some useful information, even if it's basic. So their dietary laws, their kashrut is based mainly on Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Jubilees. So they have permitted animals and forbidden animals, but they just literally say you can't have a baby goat in its mother's milk. That's the rule, like literally. But the general milk meat split is not there. They have a lunar calendar. I'm trying to find their special holiday, which is called. No, I'm missing.
Cheshvan? Cheshvan?
No, Cheshvan is just the name of the month.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of their special holiday. It's you'll have to search for it on your own. But it's now become a sort of a national holiday in Israel as a way to celebrate this community, sort of like a Cinco de Mayo Day or a St. Patrick's Day. I don't know why I'm blanking on the name of that holiday. Well, in any case, let me do one more search here. Beta Israel Revelation holiday. And Sigid, S-I-G-D, that's it. It's 50 days after Yom Kippur. And that celebrates their belief that that's when a certain revelation took place. So again, it's a holiday unique to that community. You don't have Sigid in other Jewish communities now, but now it's become part of the general Jewish population. And so we maybe are authorized to celebrate it, or maybe it's a kind of appropriation. We have to tease that out. So I'm curious, given this diversity of Jewish life, does it actually make sense to talk about Jewish culture, singular, or is it more accurate to talk about Jewish cultures?
Well, I mean, I think it's still, even in Catholicism, which is fairly rigid, in the sense of what's, you have different cultures. I mean, Pope Francis comes from a very different sort of cultural area and how they practice Catholicism in some ways than, say, Benedict, his predecessor, did. So here we have, I think, even more so differences because we don't have there's a chief rabbi or something in Jerusalem. I mean, this is not the guy who's recognized like the Pope is, and I don't even know, I was going to ask you a question, is if some of these other communities even have rabbis, or do they have more like priests,
Well, the Ethiopians have this kes role, which
Right.
is more like a priest. The Yemenite Jews have rabbis. The Persian Jews have rabbis.
They do, okay.
Yeah.
So there is a rabbinic tradition that's in these other
Right,
communities. So
right.
Even in India.
Yes, I believe so.
Well, I know they're connected by trade routes, so I can see that would be, but still, it seems like a lot of Jewish communities have very much taken on a lot of the local cultures of areas and where they live because they haven't been the majority, so they haven't had a chance to.
Well, so did I misname this whole class and it should be Introduction to Jewish Cultures, plural, instead of it, or is there enough in common that you can refer to a Jewish culture as if it's one thing?
I think there's a lot of differences. I think cultures is a more appropriate term myself, but.
I don't see why you can't use both. I mean, there's some common things through all of them, from
Well,
what you
that's
said.
true, yeah, that's true.
I mean, people talk about Christian culture and Christian cultures in the same way. There's sort of a common thing, and then there's all these millions of different kinds.
Subcultures maybe.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I can butt in.
Sure, sure.
I think that here in the United States, I think Jewish culture is the Ashkenazic culture. And I've heard a lot of people argue about rice on Passover. It's Sephardic, but it isn't Ashkenazic. And if you go into a Sephardic temple, the way the ark and the rabbis stand, it's foreign to us. And that's not our tradition. And I think that tradition is what you're used to and what you've grown up with.
Right. So that's true that in America, the dominant culture has been Ashkenazi because 80% of American Jews are Ashkenazi background. Although interestingly, in the latest surveys, there's an appreciable percentage of American Jews who don't choose any of those ethnic backgrounds at all. They don't claim Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi, they're just Jewish. Maybe it's because they've, been so far removed from that ethnic experience. I mean, my grandmother spoke Yiddish but didn't read it, and her grandparent, she grew up fluent. She was born in New York, so she, was fully American in her cultural experience. And my kids' grandparents, they don't speak hardly any Yiddish. And my father was from Syria, and he spoke some Arabic, but he didn't speak it to us. Like, I know how to swear, but but I don't know.
But they sort of know what a Torah looks like. And if they saw a real Ashkenazic Torah in the wooden case where it's just scrolled, that's not a Torah. That's a wooden case with a book in it.
Well, so now you've got to decide what is enough Jewishness to tie them together. I mean, think about the concept of American culture. What's American culture? It's Northeast rudeness. It's Southern gentility to white people. It's Tex-Mex cuisine. It's Cajun cuisine. It's hot dogs. It's pizza, which is Italian food but adapted in America. What's American food? Like you can't pick just one. It's all under the umbrella of American culture. Think about musical cultures and all the different kind of American music. If you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there's actually a really fun exhibit about here was the Pacific Northwest sound and here was the California rock sound, and because it's all regionally different. So, but it still has some umbrella that you might call American music. Well, so if Jewish culture is what all these groups have in common, the meeting points, you might be able to tick off a list of 10 or 15 features. And most importantly, they were expressed by people who called themselves Jews, who claimed a Jewish identity, and so maybe that's enough to give it enough of a family resemblance to call it broad Jewish culture and then Jewish subcultures for these particular communities. But when someone says they're a cultural Jew, that doesn't answer the question. You got to ask which Jewish culture is your cultural reference point, because they may not be as familiar with it. So I guess the last question to ask is, what do you think is the future of this Jewish cultural diversity? Is it destined for museumhood? Do you think that foodies interested in alternate Jewish cuisine is going to be enough to preserve it? What's going to happen to these Judaisms off the beaten path?
Well, I think that's a difficult question. I grew up in New York, and in New York, you have an Ashkenazi, Eastern European kind of, tradition, food, all that kind of good stuff. But what happens if we move to Iowa, and our kids grow up in Grinnell, where they think the menorah is a 50-pound bag of manure, because they don't know what it is. And your kid grows up there, and there's no connection to all of that sort of cultural thing, and you don't. It's difficult to really provide it in the house if you can't buy a decent bagel in Iowa. I mean, come on, that kind of thing. So I think that as people move and are mobile, I think that it will change, and yet if you're still though doing the traditional holidays and things, there'll still be a thread, I think, that will tie it all together.
I don't think you have to move, I think you just have to have a television.
Yeah.
I think that's what's happening in Pennsylvania Dutch. I mean, everybody has television, so no, they don't do what we do, so we'll do what they do. They're Americans.
Right, right. I mean, the model of the surrounding culture is there no matter where you are.
Yeah, no, it's very
And,
true. And of course, there's a lot of intermarriage, as I can attest. You know, both my parents and my wife, you know, I mean, so, and that also tends to dilute it to a certain degree. You know?
Right. Well, or, you know, dilute has sort of a negative connotation to it. It diversifies it. So,
yeah, you're right.
You know, think about a family that has a Japanese parent in the household. Maybe they'll use wasabi for their bitter herb instead of horseradish for their Passover sale.
Well, you know, I had a girl on my team.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
Yeah, Vivian Imaizumi, okay, so her parents were both from Brazil, but one was Japanese Brazilian, and that was her father. Her mother was a German Jew that had fled, the family had fled the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And they married, and she was raised in Philadelphia on the main line, and she went to temple, but, you know, she looked Japanese, and it was, people got very confused, you know, the Japanese girl going to shul, you know?
Right, with a Brazilian.
Yeah, and her parents are both communists,
Portuguese.
so that's why they left Brazil.
Yeah.
So, and eventually she worked for the CIA, which was very bizarre, but anyway, that's
Yeah.
all. But I mean, but there was a very mixed, you know, kind of.
Yeah,
Right, and that's going to add a different kind of Jewish
Yeah.
diversity that's 21st century.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I misheard, and I don't know how much this is true when I was growing up, is that like the Jews in other countries were like more orthodox. This is just my parents told me they're more orthodox because that's like the only way they were able to kind of preserve things and be more that way. But I'm wondering, is that really true? I mean, how much do they really kind of integrate and diversify into other cultures versus be insular? Is there any kind of like different trends in the different cultures?
Well, I mean, it does depend on the surrounding culture. So, like the Jews living in Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish. They didn't speak Polish at home. They didn't speak Russian at home, Ukrainian at home until the 20th century when they began to integrate. Because the surrounding culture didn't want anything to do with it. You know, Russian Orthodox Church was very anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. The Russian Tsars wanted nothing. They kept the Jews confined to the Pale of the Sun and didn't let them move. So what was there to assimilate to? No, they didn't want them in. But in China, in India, and the North African settings, Jews spoke Judeo-Arabic at home in North Africa or in Syria, where my dad's family is from, because the surrounding culture was inviting enough that it was worth connecting to. They still maintained a distinct identity, but you know, Sephardic Middle Eastern style Orthodoxy is much more laid back than Eastern European Jewish Orthodoxy, in part because they never had a secular revolution that they had to fight against and get fanatic about. And they weren't even, what we think of as Orthodox now is not how Jews lived in the Middle Ages. Remember also, you know, before Spinoza, if you went against the main tenets of the Jewish community, they could expel you, and then you were stuck because there was no secular space. You know, so you could live a somewhat relaxed traditional lifestyle as long as you didn't cross the red lines. And so modern Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy in the modern period, it doesn't even call itself Orthodoxy before the 19th century. It's a response to reform, because people are changing things, and now we have to say we have the ortho, the correct, dox doctrine. So they don't even bother with that terminology when it's all sort of a consensus of a mainstream rabbinic Judaism that can be, you know, somewhat laid back, not fanatic. So they were always integrated into surrounding cultures, and Mizrahi Jews, North African Jews, were just as serious about following the dietary laws as the Ashkenazi Jews. They just did it differently. Earl mentioned the rice issue, where Ashkenazi Jews said no rice, and Sephardic Jews said, yeah, sure, rice, no big deal. So that was one example of a more flexible approach, but it was still in the general umbrella of rabbinic Judaism. Now, I mean, Jewish assimilation to the surrounding culture to the point of becoming not Orthodox, that's a 19th century phenomenon, beginning in the early 1800s. It happens in Germany after the French Revolution, and spread under Napoleon. It happens in America after the American Revolution and the separation of religion and the federal government. So you begin to get communities in Charleston, South Carolina, for example, that say we want a society of Reformed Israelites that's going to change the prayer book and put things in English and let men and women sit together. And they're starting to make all these changes because they can. There's no established church to force them or establish synagogue, I should say, to force them to keep it the old-fashioned way. And they're interested in what their neighbors are doing and how it sounds more orderly in those churches than the cacophony of people reading at totally different times in an Orthodox synagogue. So they want to bring what they call decorum into the service. And they begin to change because they see what's going on around them and they care. I'll give you one last example. Hanukkah historically was a minor Jewish holiday. The major holidays were the three pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. The high holidays, the days of judgment, that was a big deal. Hanukkah was a minor holiday. You light some candles, you say a special blessing, you don't stop working, you don't have any dietary laws, you don't fast, some cultural foods, and you light some candles. Big deal. When does Hanukkah become important? Well, Jews were living among Christians for centuries. In the Middle Ages, right? Going back under Constantine, you know, in the Middle East as well. It's only after the 20th century, 19th century, when we care what our neighbors are doing. And our kids are going to school with their kids and hearing about all these presents that come up. And by the way, Christmas wasn't all about presents either for a long time. That's also a function of commercialism.
That's really 19th century also.
Late 19th, early 20th century commercialism that pumps up the Christmas gifts so that Hanukkah begins to have to be, Christmas was always important, but it wasn't a gift holiday. And so Hanukkah becomes more important both in significance and in gift giving as a function of the surrounding culture. So we become assimilated only in the last couple hundred years. But as Earl said, tradition is what happened before, you know, just before you woke up, and then that's tradition. So we think of Hanukkah as the big, people will say, I celebrate the high holidays, Passover and Hanukkah.
Yeah.
No, that's not what they used to be, but that is what they are now because of the surrounding culture.